Okay, so I'm trying a different method of doing the screen capture. MediaSite wasn't playing nice, um, and so I'm trying this on Zoom, which hopefully will work a little bit better, because then you can see me and then you can also see my screen. But we'll see how this goes. This topic is going to be on reading a research article. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to decipher the differences between a research article and a white paper or a practitioner article or one of those things. So when we look at a research article, the first thing that we notice is that there will be a method section. So if there's not a method section, it's not a research article. That doesn't mean it's an experiment, but it means that at the very least it's a research article because they have done something to find out something else. And so in order to do that, we will have a method section. So the first thing that you need to do is just scroll down, make sure that this does have a method and results section, and that we go from there. And so that's the first step. There should be some indication of whether or not it's an experiment within the abstract, so we should be able to determine whether or not there's a thing called PICOS, which is participants, intervention, control, and outcome. And so we should be able to, from the abstract, determine who the people were. So we're using students with or at risk for disabilities. The intervention package. So I've actually written that there was an intervention in there. And then some semblance of results should be in there. So you should be able to tell whether or not this was an intervention just by reading the abstract, because we should be able to note the participants, the intervention, there won't always be the control in there, and then the outcomes. And so if I look at this was students with or at risk for disabilities. The intervention looked at adding and subtracting fractions with unlocked denominators, and the outcome was gains on fraction probes. So now we know that we're looking at an experiment, because within the abstract, you might not be able to find it in the abstract, but if you can't find it in the abstract, it's probably not a very good article. So when we read the research articles, generally speaking, what we see is the first paragraph will be some sort of statement of the problem. And so the statement of the problem here is that we're doing really poorly in math, and that one of the areas that comes up over and over again is the need for fractions to be addressed, because fractions predict future learning in algebra. And so this is the statement of the problem. Then we describe why that problem exists. And then we move on to all of this stuff should be funneled. And so it should be coming down into making a broad statement. A broad statement would be something to the effect of many Americans continue to struggle with early math skills. And then that funnels down to students with disabilities tend to have a difficult time with fractions. And so throughout this paragraph, we started with a very big idea and funneled it down to the students that we're looking at. Then we discuss why fraction knowledge is important. And then we come on to different methods for remediating whatever that problem is. And so we kind of describe, in this paper, we're describing graduated instruction, anchored instruction, and strategy instruction are the three main things that have been used for students with disabilities to improve mathematics performance up until this point. And we describe them. Each statement then usually has a citation next to it. And again, when we're making these broad generalizations, we have a lot of citations. So anything that is a declarative statement, like we say something like students scores of both groups decreasing from 2013 to 2015. We can't just say that. We have to actually back it up with a citation. So introduction is where a lot of the references get put in. It's where we're looking at building the case for actually implementing the study that we're planning on implementing. Then we discussed different strategies that have been used, and then we discussed the limitations of those strategies. And so maybe there isn't a lot of research on them. Maybe there isn't, maybe they take a long time to implement, whatever the case may be. We sort of discuss, we're building a rationale for why our study needs to take place in the first place. So if we knew everything we needed to know about teaching fractions, there would be no reason for this study to take place. So we need to frame this in a way that states the fact that we have a need to intervene. So then we talk about, this all funnels down into these strategies that have been used, though they may have been effective for certain disability categories. There may be other strategies that could be used, and so we describe one of those strategies that we're going to be using in the paper and how it has been used. Specifically in this one, the SRSD methodology has been shown to be effective for reading and writing. We're then transferring this instructional strategy to a math domain. And then we discuss why it would be useful and those types of things. And then we discuss that strategy and its use, if it has been used at all, in our domain. And so there have been a couple of studies that have shown this, but it's been in sort of offshoots. So SRSD has been used for word problems a couple of times. It's been used for this a couple of times, but it hasn't been used as an instructional strategy to teach fractions specifically. And so that's what this paragraph sort of does, is it leads us to this purpose statement, which is, although SRSD has been used to teach mathematics skills to students with disabilities, no prior studies used SRSD to teach fractions. Oops. And then statement, which are vital to higher order mathematics skills. Purpose of the current study is to determine if SRSD can be used to teach the addition and subtraction of fractions with unlike denominators to students with or at risk for disabilities. And then this study sought to answer the following research question. And then our research question goes there. We don't need to worry about stating the null hypothesis. We don't need to worry about necessarily stating our hypothesis. We just move on to the research question. I haven't read a study not that I've been doing this forever, but in the almost 10 years that I've been in the field, I haven't read a study where they have put down the null hypothesis. So we don't need to worry about this. But what is important to note, and what you're going to be working towards, is we need to get this first part under control. So we need to build the foundation for your study. And so I will be expecting an introduction. That introduction necessarily won't change from the 3 write-ups that we have, but in the 3 write-ups, I would expect there to be an introduction. So you're looking at probably, if we look at this in the Word form instead of the format that it was used in publication, this paper, this is not the right folder. There it is. We're looking at essentially 1, 2, 3, 4.5 pages to get you to the method section. So I would expect an introduction that was going to be 3 or 4 pages that funnels us down into a purpose statement and a research question. And so statement of the problem, interventions that have been done before, the specific intervention that you're using, then the purpose, and building the literature on those things, and the purpose, and then the research question. So those things would need to be outlined, and I don't have a specific due date for that, but by the time that that first write-up comes, it should come with an introduction piece within it. I wouldn't worry about writing a whole lot of research questions. One research question is sufficient. I mean, if you have more research questions, that's fine, but I think that for our intents and purposes and for what we're doing in here, I think one research question is just fine. Then we get to the method section, and generally speaking, if we look at the APA JARS reading that we put out a couple of days ago, or that's on Canvas, let's figure out where that was. JARS, qual, APA JARS. So when we look at this, we should see the following. Title page, title and title page, abstract, introduction, and then the method section. And the method section would include inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, participant characteristics, sampling procedures, and all of these things. And so when you get into specific designs, there's going to be more stuff that needs to be on there. I haven't broken it down into the headings that they suggested, because the headings that I have work. And so, but generally speaking, we start with the setting. And so we discuss the setting that we are going to be conducting the study in. And this is a very broad setting. This is saying, you know, we're in the rural Midwest. We got IRB approval. The demographics of the school look like this. And this is the percentage of students with disabilities, blah, 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 blah. And so then we get down to participants, and then we have inclusion criteria. So we have 5th grade students were screened for participation. They needed to have a failing grade on the unit test and be considered at risk for math. And then the sampling procedure in accordance with the IRB, a total of 18 students were approached to participate in the study, 16 returned consent forms, participant characteristics. And for these kinds of things, you're going to be, what I would suggest that you do is go to the website of a local school and find out this information. And you are writing these method sections in the past tense. And some people, for your dissertation or something like that, will have you write in the future tense, but then you have to go back and change it to the past tense. So don't even worry about it. Just write it in the past tense for us. And then you're going to give me a best case scenario of what you were hoping to find. So then when I start talking about participant characteristics and stuff like that, you're going to make up a little fiction of who these students were that you chose for your study. Then we, in our field specifically, but in a lot of fields, we want to know who it was that was actually delivering the intervention to the students, because findings will be different whether or not it was a researcher that was doing this. So let's say I developed the program, and in this case I did. If I was the one that goes in there and teaches it, I'm probably going to do a little bit better of a job at it than a teacher who had just been trained on it, or who maybe didn't receive a lot of training on it. Obviously, it's because I know it better, and so I'm going to teach it better because I developed it. I'm also going to have a more vested interest in this thing happening the way that I wanted it to. And in this case, I was one of the teachers, and then we had graduate students. One was a graduate student, one was a former graduate student. Both had teaching licenses, but only one of them was teaching in the classroom. And so we just make sure that we list who those people were, so that when people are replicating this, they can say things like, well, this was researcher implemented, and so we're going to replicate this study, but we're going to do it with trained teachers instead, and see if there's a difference in results. So we want to have a section in there that talks about who the intervention agent is and their experience and those kinds of things. Then we come down to the outcome measures. The outcome measures in this case were fraction probes that we created. what you're going to want to make sure that you're finding is that, you're, in very rare circumstances, you're going to have to create your own outcome measure. There's usually, you'll find in a dissertation or a study that's been done before, and what I would expect and not only expect, but encourage you to do is find other studies that have done essentially the same thing that you're looking for. Find out what those outcome measures were. Find out what they were measuring, and do those measures come over to your study. And so, and in most cases, you'll be able to find something. And there's very few areas where we just do not have an outcome measure for these things. And so I would encourage you to look at past research and find outcome measures that are going to work for your specific research question. In this case, there weren't any. And so for the type of design that we were using, there weren't any outcome measures that we could use. And so we created our own outcome measures and used previous research to determine how we were going to deliver those outcome measures and how we were going to score them. So then we have a participant graph table. I wouldn't necessarily worry about this for any of your studies because you're going to be making all of this stuff up. You can go ahead and make it if you want to, but it's not a requirement. And then we have, because this is a single case design experiment, our reliability comes from the fact that someone else can view the results and come up with a reasonable approximation of what I came up with. So if I graded it a certain way and then I have a research assistant grade them, we should be over 80% agreement on the measure. If you're using something that is an already packaged measure, like let's say Beck depression inventory, it'll have reliability and validity estimates in it, and that would go under the actual measure. So you would have so this could say the Beck depression inventory, and then we would describe the Beck depression inventory, and then we would provide information on the reliability and validity of that measure that we would find from either the measure itself or other published studies that have looked at this measure. And so a lot of this, you're going to be just having to, well, if I'm using the Beck depression inventory, I need to look at other studies that have used the Beck depression inventory. I need to type into Google Beck depression inventory, reliability and validity. And then we would cite, when we talk about the reliability and validity, we would cite where we got that information from. Another thing to discuss when we're talking about citing is that you need to cite the original person. So I got a paper back, or I reviewed a paper for a journal a couple of days ago, and they had said that, Johnson and Smith said that 30% of people with disabilities have problems with lung division or whatever. But I knew that study, and that study was an actual study of an intervention. And so, though it was probably written in the study at some point, the information that 30% of students with disabilities, and I'm making this up, that information was cited in the study as being another study that actually found that out. So you would need to go to that first study and cite that study, not the... So if I wrote in here, you don't want to cite my paper as saying math performance is bad. You want to actually look for the people that I cited to make that connection. And though it's fun to be able to cite yourself and do those kinds of things, that's not the way that it works. You need to cite the original author. So then another thing that we look at in special education specifically, but I think it's moving forward in the field of education more broadly, is this idea of social validity. And social validity is whether or not the goals, the outcomes, and the effects are actually socially valid. So if we're talking about things like, does this can I get the student to look me in the eye? Well, is that actually a socially valid intervention? Is that something that we need to actually be doing an intervention on? And and so if we, let's say, this is going to sound horrible, and I don't expect anybody to do it, and I would hope that nobody does it, and I'm just using it as an example, but I want a kid to look me in the eye. And so every time I come up to him and say hi, if he doesn't look me in the eye, I zap him. And then he starts looking at me in the eye. Well, that's not an acceptable intervention, obviously. And so the acceptability of it is going to be very low. And did we actually need to intervene on this in the first place? Well, to me, looking somebody in the eye is a social construct that we have decided, particularly in the South, but whatever, that people are just supposed to do. But if you have a child with autism, if you have a child from a different culture, they may be trained not to do that. A child with autism might find it very aversive to look somebody in the eye. And so we need to kind of step back and say, should we have been doing this in the first place? And are the methods that we're using acceptable to people? And so we have written down the goals of the study, whether or not the outcome of it is an important outcome, and whether or not the intervention was determined to be acceptable. And so to do that, the acceptability part, you don't need to make your own surveys. There's already surveys out there. There's the Children's Intervention Rating Profile. It has good reliability and validity, blah, 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 blah. And so I just use that as a measure of whether or not the treatment was acceptable to both the students and the teacher. And then we come down to the experimental design. In this study, we used a single case design. I describe what what it is, and again, I cite someone, describe what it is and how we used it. Baseline would also be a control condition. So how do we, in order to run an experiment correctly, or at least well, we need some sort of control group. We need some sort of baseline that says, this is where the students would have been had the intervention not happened. And so this section is going to discuss what they were doing in their general education setting or wherever they were, what program they were using. You can actually see that we discuss that Math in Focus, Singapore Math, is what they use in Tier 2 mathematics blocks, how long that occurred, how often they were getting it, those kinds of things. And then we describe our intervention. And this is going to be, this needs to be done in such a way that someone else could pick this paper up and conceivably replicate everything that I've done. All of this method section should be written in such a way that someone else could pick it up and go, okay, I could actually do this study. Maybe I would need a little bit more information, like we have lesson plans and we have everything that goes along with this thing. That's not listed here. It's listed in the materials, but it's not, we don't actually write the lesson plan into the method section. And so, but we do give a very detailed description of what we did so that somebody else could come behind us and replicate this. And so you can see there's a couple of pages just describing exactly what we did, how many days it took, what was going on during each day, what was going on during each lesson. Then we have a description of the materials that we used. And then we have treatment fidelity, which should be in any plan. And treatment fidelity is essentially going to say, you know, we delivered this intervention. We have a checklist made that is going to go through each component part of the intervention, and we're going to check that off each time we do it. And so we had the teacher, as they were going along, they would check off that they hit each step of the lesson plan. And then on 30% of occasions throughout the intervention, we would have somebody else come through and check it off. And the reason that we do these kinds of things is because we know that, you know, if I give you a set of lesson plans and I give you all these things and you just decide to go off on your own, well, maybe the treatment effects had to do with you going off on your own and doing those things, or maybe the lack of treatment effect had to do, which is usually more the case. Maybe that lack of a treatment plan had to do with you not getting the results that you got. And so what we know, is that, like, if you're going to use a program like Second Step for a social emotional learning, if it's not implemented with fidelity, it's not going to work. If you don't implement PBIS with fidelity, it's not going to work. If you don't implement students' behavior intervention plans with fidelity, they're not going to work. And so we know that fidelity of implementation has a big part of all these things. So we want to document that this thing was implemented with fidelity, and so that we know that what we wrote, that the procedures were, has to do with that we did that, and that we followed it precisely, and it came out with these results. And then in the data analysis section, this is a single case design, so this is going to be a little bit different, but this is where you're going to describe your data analytic strategy. This is where you're going to discuss, we used an ANOVA, and we looked for violations of assumptions, and we did this, and we did this, and we did this. And it should be written again in a way that if I were to come back behind you and I grabbed your data, I should be able to analyze it in exactly the same way and come up with the same answer, or at least really close to the same answer. Obviously, you use if I use R and then I use SPSS and then I use something else, there may be small differences in the standard errors. So there might be small differences in this, and this might be small, but they're going to be small, and we should be able to come up with a reasonable proximity to what this author came up with. Once a data analysis has been written, then you're going on to the results section. The results section usually starts with a broad paragraph that kind of describes the overall effect. And then we would come down, treatment fidelity is getting discussed, so the results of the treatment fidelity, and then the results, this is in a single case design study, so then the results for each individual, in this case school, and how that played out. And then these graphs with a single case design go along with that as well. And the graphs in a single case design are actually the data analysis results more than, we describe them in paper, but this is what people are actually looking for rather than p-values and stuff like that. We're looking for a change from baseline to post-intervention. And then we have the discussion. Where does the discussion actually start? Okay, so then we talked about the results of sociability, and then we have the discussion. In the discussion, you're basically going to write a summary statement that is almost like the abstract. You're talking about, we examine the impact of this intervention on fraction computation of students with disabilities, blah, blah, blah. Taught the following skills, results, and we provide a general statement about the results that it did pretty good. And then we end with, next we will discuss the results of the study with respect to the research question, treatment fidelity and social validity, provide limitations to the study, and propose areas for research. So there's a couple of sections. There is the research questions would each have a heading, treatment fidelity would have a heading, social validity would have a heading, limitations and future research would then have their own heading too. And so your discussion kind of gets broken down into, we discuss the research question, we frame that into what happened and how that affects the larger literature, and then we go on to provide limitations of the study. So we pick it apart and talk about all the things that could have happened that made these results happen the way that they did, and then areas for future research. So, and then sometimes we'll have a conclusion. This part of it, the results of the discussion, you guys aren't writing. You guys are only writing the intro and the method section. So I don't need to see results from data analysis. I don't need to see results from anything. All I need to see is the intro and the method section. But in a nutshell, that's how we look at reading a research report and the things that go into a research report. If you have any questions, give me a holler, and we will see you next time.